Responsible business practices are important because businesses need to make profit without causing problems for people. Problems for people, problems for the environment. Because if they are causing those problems, it's either going to hurt their business or it's going to hurt the wider set of stakeholders. So if we don't have responsible business practices, soon we will have no planet, or we will have a business that has a large demonstration outside its factory gates, and potentially that can even lead to the business closing down. I can give a lot of examples of how businesses have been managing this. For example, as I've said, they're looking at safety of employees. They're looking at when it's safe to open, when it's safe to close. When the demonstrations were happening in February and March, they were looking at the question of how to treat their employees who wanted to take time off to do demonstrations. For some of them, the employees were actually regarding that as CDM, as actually sort of refusing to go to work. For many companies, that was fine, but they were, if on strike, they were on unpaid leave. For the companies, they had at some point to say, are you coming back to work or not? And for some of them, they even said, okay, you may not want to come back to work now. You may want to continue to take unpaid leave. That's okay, but stay in touch with us. Obviously, that's not important for every company who is dependent on the 20 employees that it has to function. But if you are a large employer with thousands of employees and some of your staff say they want to take unpaid leave for whatever reason, that is something that you can manage as a bank. So these are all the questions that HR departments from the banks, from the shopping centres, from the factories were all considering. So the question of whether companies should be engaging with the state authorities is a really important and challenging one in the current political context in Myanmar. I think you need to make a distinction between the political element of a government and the regulatory officials, which are really the civil servants, because any company that wants to be responsible has to obey the law. That is the kind of number one rule, whether you are an international company coming here or a Myanmar company. The rule of law and being compliant with law is number one rule of responsible business. Now, sometimes those laws are unethical or are not protecting human rights. And when that's the case, you either choose not to come or not to enter that particular business sector, or maybe have to choose to leave. But by and large, the laws that companies deal with around employment, around environment, are intended to protect human rights, and companies therefore need to comply with them. So our advice is that you need to continue to follow the law. You need to continue to respond to any calls for inspection from the regulator. However, we would not encourage companies to stick their head up above the parapet and have what looks more like a ceremonial ribbon-cutting relationship with the government. That is serving to both harm the reputation of the company, given what people currently feel about the military, but it's also actually not necessary or not appropriate, I think, in the current context. What we've seen is companies are doing their absolute best to avoid being visited by Min Aung Hlaing or any of the ministers, because they see this as actually being very damaging, not just for the company's reputation, but even for safety issues. So I think that the military, the SAC ministers are starting to realise that, and they're also not putting companies in that position. But when it comes to basic regulatory compliance, a company has no choice. So unless there is peace and stability in a country, and unless there is a sort of an optimistic prospect of where the country is going, where the human capital wants to stay in the country rather than leave. I mean, right now, middle-class talent is leaving to go to the US and Australia. Migrant labour is planning to cross the border to Thailand as soon as it can. So if you have a country like that, that is not an attractive place to invest, whether you are a foreign company or a Myanmar company. And the reason that is happening is because of the political situation. So there has to be a resolution to the political situation in order to restore the economy to a trajectory, a track that it was expected to be following back in February 1st, 2021. I think that the economic situation, obviously, as we know, took a huge hit with COVID in 2020 and in 2021, but then the coup has made it much, much worse. So the projections for the economy were I think, 20% contraction, really, for this last 2021 year. So that impacts on spending power. It impacts on the chat exchange rate. It has all sorts of impacts that have an impact on business. Now, it can't go on that bad forever. We've gone down to there. The question is, will we ever come back up again? And how long will that take? And I think that is totally dependent on a political resolution to the situation, which is based on trust, on building peace, and on trying to restore genuine democracy. So that's what businesses need right now. Consumer pressure, I think, is hugely important in all countries, not just Myanmar. It's something where I think there's always been an overestimation of its power, because in the end, and particularly if you're looking in, let's say, the UK, people actually don't care that much about the conditions under which their clothing that they buy is made. They're looking at price. Same is true for the food that they buy. They don't care about what the farmers got for it, with the exception of a very small minority of people who buy ethical products, sustainable products. Here in Myanmar, actually, the consumer movement is probably one of the strongest, at least in terms of boycotts and so on. I think what's really important is it needs to be based on good facts. So to take an example of a bad approach, back in, I think it was March, when the military started to clear out the barriers, they used JCB bulldozers, which they got out of the YCDC compound. And so people said, oh, JCB, where is that from? Oh, that's from Serge Pun's company. Therefore, we must go out and boycott KFC. Now, that to me was illogical. These are JCBs which were sold to actually an NLD regional government long ago. You know, why is that the fault of KFC? Why is that having a negative impact on KFC employees? The other issue is when consumer boycotts lead into violence. So what we're seeing now in terms of attacks on KBZ ATMs, that to me has nothing to do with enlightened consumers. Yes. That is actually violence which is probably going to hurt a passerby on a bicycle on the main street that gets hit by the shrapnel. So these are the kind of violent attacks on businesses which one could never condone in the name of responsible business. Yes. One of the other major problems for responsible business in Myanmar now is the question of working conditions and exploitative working conditions, particularly in sectors at the lower end and the labour-intensive end of the chain, whether it's garments manufacturing or small businesses, because people are desperate for jobs, people are not able to migrate at the moment, and the minimum wage has not been raised now since 2018. It's still 4,600 kyat. So companies can claim to be legally compliant by paying that amount, but they are definitely being exploitative. How do you fix that problem? It's extremely difficult because it's related to people's economic desperation, and in particular in businesses which don't have the influence, for example, of an international brand, or which don't have a union that's functioning. It's quite difficult for workers to be able to push back if they have no other choices. In most cases, workers respond to this situation by voting with their feet and crossing the border as soon as they're able to. And that's why we're going to see a massive increase in migrant labour to Thailand, Malaysia and elsewhere, because of low wages here and people's perception that they will do better if they go overseas. And so, yes, the market will perhaps respond a little bit to that. But the main thing that needs to be done is to raise the minimum wage. Unfortunately, that in Myanmar right now is a political challenge because the process for raising that wage involves tripartite dialogue with the trade unions, and the military has made many of those trade unions, particularly at the top leadership level, it's made them illegal. So the tripartite dialogue function is not working. So how we will get that addressed across the board is difficult to say. But if it's at a level or in for example, a supplier for a multinational, it's one of those things that the multinational should be asking as part of its heightened human rights due diligence. How much are you paying the workers which are making the T-shirts that I am buying? And so what you see with many of the more responsible garment brands is daily or weekly monitoring of working conditions, payroll, so that they can get a sense of whether the factory is actually moving into very exploitative practices.